The subject today is the knowledge economy, and I will begin. This is a theme of vast practical and theoretical importance. As I hope will become clear in the course of the discussion, the fate of the knowledge economy, the choice among its alternative futures increasingly lies at the center of the world debate about economic transformation. It is also a subject of transcendent theoretical importance, and I hope as well that the course of our conversation will demonstrate the validity of the view that the greatest economic thinkers, among them Karl Marx and Adam Smith, had, that the most promising way to understand the fundamentals of economic life is to study the most advanced practice of production in our historical circumstance. And that is now the knowledge economy. I will divide my remarks into three parts. In the first part, I address the nature of the knowledge economy. I characterize this advanced practice of production. In the second part of my remarks, I deal with the problem of the confinement of the knowledge economy to fringes of the production system. The character of this confinement, its consequences, and the economic phenomena to which it is related. And then in the third part of my remarks, I want to revisit the reference that we made last week to the emerging dilemma of development, as I called it. Now, although I called it the dilemma of development, it should be clear that everything that we are discussing here applies just as much to the richest economies of the world as to the major developing countries, and shows in this way how this distinction between the debate about economic growth and the debate about economic development, meaning the growth of the less rich countries, has ceased to make sense. Now then, this would be, as it were, the first step, the first part of our discussion of the knowledge economy. The second part is the exploration of the conditions under which this most advanced practice of production can be widely disseminated in the whole of the economy. And that discussion, a programmatic discussion as well as a theoretical one, would then come either later in today's class, depending on how our conversation proceeds, or in the first class after this break that we have now, because we have no class next week. So then 2 weeks from now. The nature of the knowledge economy. In every historical circumstance, there is a most advanced practice of production. And our conception of the nature of the most advanced practice, that is, of what makes it most advanced, changes in the course of economic history. The most advanced practice of production is not necessarily, in the short term, the most efficient practice. It is the practice that has the greatest potential not only to reach the frontier of productivity, but also to remain there, and to inspire, by example, the transformation of the surrounding economy. The most advanced practice of production is the practice with, in this sense, the greatest fecundity. Now, in the light of the transformation that is taking place in our own time, we can come to think as well that the most advanced practice of production is the practice that is closest to the imagination, to our imaginative powers, and therefore the practice that most fully reveals our potential. Until recently, the most advanced practice of production was what we call mass production, sometimes called as well Fordist mass production. Mass production is the large-scale production of standardized goods and services with rigid machines and production processes on the basis of semi-skilled labor and very hierarchical and specialized relations of production. Now there emerges another most advanced practice of production, which we're calling here the knowledge economy, sometimes as well called the new economy or post-Fordist production, by contrast to Fordist mass production and its precursor, mechanized manufacturing. Now I want to characterize this most advanced practice of production at succeeding levels of depth. At the surface, it is characterized by the accumulation of knowledge, technology, and capital, and by the use of the most advanced technologies of today, including so-called additive manufacturing and robotics, and now especially and increasingly machine learning and artificial intelligence. However, as will soon become apparent, the exclusive association of the knowledge economy with high technology industry is a misunderstanding. The knowledge economy, in principle, is applicable to every part of the system of production. At a second level, a deeper level of the organization of work and production engineering, the knowledge economy is distinguished by the following pair of characteristics. The first of these characteristics is the reconciliation of large-scale production with destandardization or customization. The characteristic practices and technologies of the knowledge economy make it possible intentionally to vary the products and services while retaining large scale in production. The second such characteristic is the reconciliation of a great decentralization of initiative. Initiative accorded not just to individual workers, but also to work groups or teams, with the maintenance of coordination and momentum in the process of production. So in other words, the knowledge economy is distinguished by an overcoming of a simple model of command and control in the organization of work. One way to understand its characteristic tendency is by a military analogy. So mass production resembles a traditional structure of an infantry battalion. Very hierarchical, very specialized, and very rigid in the operational theater. And the knowledge economy, by virtue of the second attribute that I've described, resembles a guerrilla or a special force in which the participants in the military structure enjoy a great margin of maneuver and discretion in the theater without losing the characteristics of operational coordination. So now if you combine these two characteristics, these two pairs of characteristics, still thinking of the military comparison, it's as if the latent aspiration of the knowledge economy with respect to the organization of productive activity were the analog to a military force in which the whole of the army acquires the characteristics of a guerrilla force or a special force. That is, its radical flexibility of maneuver without thereby sacrificing its coherence in the deployment of its tactical activity in the theater. Now I come to a third set of characteristics, the deeper characteristics of the knowledge economy. And the account of these characteristics represents an interpretation of the potential of the knowledge economy more than it does a description of its present form. So what happens in the evolution of every practice of production is that it deepens, that is to say, it radicalizes and reveals its potential as it spreads. There is a relation between its horizontal extension and its vertical deepening. And because the knowledge economy now exists in a very confined form, that is, confined only to certain parts of production, its deeper characteristics and potential are not fully manifest. So it is an inference, then, to develop this view that I now summarize of these deeper characteristics. Now, let me state these deeper characteristics in three sets. The first deeper characteristic is the potential that the knowledge economy has to loosen or even to reverse the constraint of diminishing returns. Now, if there is any regularity of economic life in the previous history of humanity that has a claim to be considered a universal law of economic activity, it is this constraint of diminishing returns. This has been the most tenacious and the most universal regularity of economic life. It is therefore puzzling that its basis has never been explained. One searches in vain in the literature of economics for a developed account of the foundation of the constraint of diminishing returns. My suggestion is that the basis of the constraint of diminishing returns is the external and episodic character of innovation in the previous dominant practices of production. So an innovation arises characteristically from outside the production system, inspired by the advance of science and technology. It is translated into a set of characteristic machines and practices. It results in a spurt of growth and productivity, and then this spurt peters out. there's a connection between the diminishing returns, the constraint of diminishing returns, and this exogenous and episodic character of innovation. The knowledge economy, however, holds the potential to establish innovation in a form that is not only internal to the production system, but perpetual. Perpetual and continuous innovation rather than discontinuous and exogenous innovation. And this change in the relation of production to innovation may then be the beginning of an explanation of this extraordinary promise of the knowledge economy to loosen or even to reverse what has up to now been the most constant regularity of economic life. Now, it has been commonly observed that the knowledge economy might loosen or reverse this constraint of diminishing returns because of its relation to the development of knowledge. So there's this intuitive idea. The more you know, the easier it is to develop knowledge at the next step. In other words, production comes to participate increasingly in the life of the mind and less in the life of nature, of the transformation of nature. And the explanation that I've offered is really, in a way, an unpacking or a development of this inchoate intuition. Now comes the second set of deeper characteristics of the knowledge economy, or of its potential. And that has to do with the intimate relation that it establishes or tightens between discovery and production, between imagination and work. Traditionally, we think of economic growth as being supported by science embodied in technology. But now, in the development of the knowledge economy, it's as if production increasingly became the materialization of scientific discovery. So think, for example, of a 3D printer, still a relatively primitive technology associated with the knowledge economy. The operator of the 3D printer has a conjecture about a material product or service, which he uses the 3D printer to materialize. And then in the course of materializing that product, the operator discovers new possibilities and varies the product so that the passage from conception to materialization and back again to the revision of the conception is accelerated. Karl Popper said that, the philosopher of science, that the point in science is to make mistakes as quickly as possible. And it's as if now, through these practices and technologies of the knowledge economy, this became as well the character, the spirit of the practice of production. So on one side, increasingly, the work team or the firm are organized as if they were a laboratory engaged in a scientific project. And the best firms become more like the best schools. On the other hand, there emerges the possibility of radically changing the relation between the worker and the machine. I observed in a previous class that under the earlier advanced practices of production, mechanized manufacturing and Fordist mass production, the worker worked as if he were one of his machines. In Adam Smith's pin factory or in Henry Ford's assembly line, the worker engages in repetitious, formulaic actions, mimicking the movements of his rigid machines. Now the machines become much more flexible. Numerically controlled machine tools can be continuously reprogrammed. And yet we have the idea under the radicalized form of the knowledge economy that the worker, rather than mimicking the machine, can always be ahead of his machine. So everything that we have learned how to repeat, we embodied in a formula or an algorithm. And then we express the algorithm or the formula in a physical contraption, the machine. The machine does for us everything that we have learned how to repeat so that we can preserve our supreme resource, our time, for the not yet repeatable. And then the combination of worker and machine would become much more powerful than either the worker or the machine alone. Now let's develop this idea just for a moment. You could say there are 3 levels. So let's call the first level the algorithmic machine. That's the vast preponderance of the prior history of technology. The machine that repeats for us what we have learned how to repeat according to a formula or to an algorithm. Now then there's a second level. You could call it the problem-solving machine, as under machine learning. It may go beyond what any formula or algorithm may be able to guide. It has a pragmatic residue. It solves practical problems. They may be complex practical problems, like the production of autonomous vehicles, or even very simple practical problems, which turn out to be astonishingly complex as problems of engineering, like how to open a doorknob. And now it seems that the technologies of the advanced knowledge economy, of this advanced practice of production, are still in the relatively early stages of the development of what I'm calling problem-solving machines. But there's a third level. And the third level is the level of the imagination. Can there be an imaginative machine? There cannot. We are, or can and should become, these imaginative machines or anti-machines. What is the imagination? The imagination has 2 moves. The move of distancing itself from the immediate object, and then the move of subsuming that object under a greater range of transformative variations. By the work of the imagination, we discover something that our established methods and presuppositions will not countenance. And then retrospectively, we change the methods and the presuppositions to make sense of what we have discovered. That is the imagination. And that, it seems, is what even in principle no machine could ever do. So the promise of the knowledge economy is that even as the character of our machines advanced, we would be one step ahead. And this combination of what machines cannot even in principle do with what they can do once developed then becomes the revolutionary technological characteristic of the knowledge economy. Now I come to a third set of deeper attributes of the knowledge economy in its potential, that has to do with the transformation of the moral culture of production. All previous forms of economic life and advanced practices of production have been characterized by the generalization of a modicum of low trust. So earlier forms of economic organization before the rise of the modern market economy in the West were characterized, as the classic social theorists observed, by a contrast between high trust to insiders in a kinship or religious group and no trust to strangers. And then we have had forms of economic life that are based on the universalization of low trust. So the whole market economy can be understood as a simplified form of cooperation among strangers that is impossible when there is no trust and unnecessary when there is high trust. And this is as well the moral climate or presupposition of mass production, of these earlier practices of production. They're systems of command and control. Their hierarchies and specializations are based on the assignment of a very narrow range of discretion and of trust to the workers, to the participants in the process of production. Residual command is reserved to the managers who rule in the name of property. The knowledge economy, for its progress, depends on the transformation of this moral culture. It requires that all participants in the process of production enjoy a higher level of discretion and of trust. And it characteristically mixes up, rather than assigning to distinct domains, cooperation and competition. In those regions in which the knowledge economy, and specifically high-tech industry, has most flourished, we observe formalized or informal practices of cooperative competition. There is a circulation of resources, technologies, practices, and ideas among firms that continue to compete with one another, as well as within firms. They cooperate at the same time that they compete. And this is, in principle, a momentous transformation in the moral culture of production. Now, of course, for this transformation to flourish, for it to develop, it's hard to see how economically dependent wage labor could continue to be the predominant form of free labor. It would have to give way later, under different property and contract regimes, to the higher forms of free labor, self-employment and cooperation. I now come to the second part of my remarks. Having characterized the knowledge economy at the surface and at increasing depth, to deal with the great problem of its confinement. The knowledge economy now exists in all the major economies of the world under quarantine. Mass production or mechanized manufacturing, although associated with one sector of the economy, industry, by its very nature, served as a model for the transformation of every part of the economy, including agriculture. In principle, the knowledge economy should be susceptible to even more universal dissemination, because it has no intrinsic connection to any part of production. Nevertheless, we observe the opposite. The knowledge economy is confined. It's not just confined to one part of industry. It appears now in every sector of the economy. In knowledge-intensive services, and in precision or scientific agriculture. And indeed, the very distinctions among sectors begin to be effaced because advanced manufacturing consists, in a sense, in crystallized intellectual services. Nevertheless, in each sector of production, the knowledge economy appears as a fringe from which the vast majority of workers and firms remain excluded. This is what I'm calling the problem of confinement, of the confinement of the knowledge economy. And I began to offer in last week's class an explanation of this confinement by comparison to mass production. Mass production relies on a very stereotypical set of technologies and practices that can be readily transported from one place to another. And despite the lip service paid to the importance of institutions and of education, in fact, the presuppositions of mass production are very lax. They are minimalist. By contrast, it seems that this advanced practice of production has very demanding assumptions and is not so easily portable from one place to another as if it were a kit that could be taken somewhere else to a radically different situation in order to guarantee so-called unconditional convergence to the most advanced level of growth. Now, consider 4 phenomena that are causally connected with this insular form of the knowledge economy. The first phenomenon is a change in the character of the international division of labor. The major premise of traditional trade theory is that world trade is organized on the basis of trade between the advanced capital-intensive economies and the relatively backward labor-intensive economies. Now we have a situation in which this advanced practice of production, the knowledge economy, is established as a fringe or as a set of fringes in every major economy in the world. In the major developing countries as well as in the richest economies. And these vanguards are in communion with one another, exchanging goods and services, people and resources, practices and technologies. In a sense, this network, this worldwide network of the vanguard is the commanding force in the world economy, if it has any commanding force. And by comparison to it, international finance is a sideshow. Now, the second empirical phenomenon to which I draw your attention is what you could call hyper-insularity. I said the knowledge economy in its present form is insular. Rather than there being a tendency to overcome this insularity through the dissemination of the most advanced practice of production, it seems that the very opposite is happening. It's becoming more insular rather than less insular. The firms that specialize in this advanced practice of production have discovered a way to routinize or commoditize parts of their business. And these commoditized or routinized parts of their business, they then subcontract to firms and workers in other parts of the world who continue to operate under the paradigm of traditional mass production, conventional industrialization. So conventional industrialization for this mass production now exists in the world in two distinct forms. One form is as a leftover of the earlier practice of production. And the second form is as what in last week's class I call a sidekick, a subordinate part of the process of production organized by these advanced firms. And it's this process that I'm calling hyperinsularity. In other words, the entrepreneurial and technological elites that control the insular form of the knowledge economy retreat more and more into an inner sanctum and find ways then to factor out of their process of production whatever can be routinized or commoditized. The third empirical phenomenon I want to label pseudo-vanguardism. So the firms of this advanced practice of production produce the goods and services that they sell widely. Their digital technologies, their information and communication technologies, notably. But the mere acquisition and use of these technologies does not turn firms and workers into parts of the vanguard. This is what I'm calling pseudo-vanguardism. So, for example, even a mega firm like Walmart in the United States acquires the advanced technologies and uses them to manage complex information and to establish a just-in-time management of its inventory. And this phenomenon of a one-time boost to productivity may help explain, for example, why in the United States, for a decade between 1995 and 2004, there was a one-time rise in productivity that then fell back. It's not the incorporation of the second tier of firms and of production into the genuine knowledge economy. So the existence of this pseudo-vanguardism may delude us into supposing that the advanced practice of production is being disseminated when in fact it is not. Now comes the fourth empirical phenomenon. The fourth empirical phenomenon is precarization. The abandonment of an increasing part of the labor force in all the major economies of the world, rich as well as developing, to precarious employment, including temporary or conditional labor contracts without the traditional rights of stable employment. Under this form of hyperinsularity, the firms discover a way to dispense with a stable labor force, assembled in large productive units, factories. So what we think of as the standard basis for the organization of labor under mass production really only prevails securely in the world from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th. And it was then the basis for the representation of labor, for the classic labor law regimes, whether contractualist or corporatist. And it became as well the political basis for the social democratic or left-leaning parties in the world. It was preceded in economic history by several centuries in which labor was organized on the basis of decentralized contractual arrangements, like the putting out system described by Marx in the early chapters of Capital. And now it seems that we have in the world a new putting out system on a global scale. And what we think of as the normal form of the organization and representation of labor may turn out, in retrospect, to have been only a relatively brief interlude between two long periods in which labor was organized on the basis of these decentralized contractual arrangements. Now comes the central issue of the consequence of this confinement of the advanced practice of production to the fringes. This is what makes the issue that we're discussing central to the world debate. So first, there are the consequences for inequality. They are obvious. That we have not just a reinvention, but an aggravation, a deepening of the contrast between the advanced and backward sectors of production. The insularity or the hyperinsularity result in a widening of the chasm between the advanced and the backward sectors of production. And this widening then becomes a motor of the creation of inequality, to such an extent that the two traditional devices for the moderation of inequality, which are compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer, progressive taxation and redistributive social entitlements on the one side, and the defense of small business against big business on the other side, become inadequate antidotes to this extreme inequality. The second set of consequences of the confinement has to do with economic stagnation. You know that there is now in the United States a discourse that goes under the label of secular stagnation, appropriating a term of Alvin Hansen's from the 1920s, and that claims that the decline in productivity and therefore in the rise of productivity and therefore in growth is somehow a natural consequence of demographic factors, of insufficiency of demand, but above all of what is supposedly a lesser potential of contemporary technologies when compared to the technological innovations of 100 years ago. This is an attempt to naturalize, to make seem natural what has nothing natural about it. The more obvious explanation of stagnation is that we have relative stagnation in these economies because their most advanced practice of production is confined rather than disseminated. How could it be otherwise? If the most productive practice is limited to a small part of the labor force and of firms, how could there not be relative stagnation? So this then is a subject of vast importance. Now then, at the end, in this third step of remarks, I want to go back to what I labeled in the last class, the dilemma of development. Recall what the dilemma is. It's not a dilemma just for so-called developing countries. It's also the same dilemma for the richest countries, for the United States, for Germany, for Japan. On the one hand, this is the first horn of the dilemma, conventional industrialization no longer works as a formula for so-called unconditional convergence. Unconditional convergence to the level development of the richest economies. And again, I restate the suggestion of why this formula has stopped working. So first, it has stopped working because conventional industrialization for this mass production is no longer the vanguard. It is either a leftover, a relatively backward practice of production, or it is an accomplice, a subordinate piece of a process of production organized by the real vanguard. This is mass production not as the leftover, but as the sidekick. The second reason why it no longer works is that increasingly the combination of the vanguard with the sidekick is able to outproduce and outcompete what leftover mass production does to produce more, better, at lower cost. The third reason is that the residual form of industrialization is caught in a race to the bottom in the worldwide competition of labor and tax arbitrage. That is, in the search for countries with lower returns to labor and a lower tax burden. And this depression of the returns to labor and of the possibilities of public investment is in turn inimical to innovation, to any prospect of the lifting up of the vast economic rearguard to a higher level. And the fourth reason is that the very distinctions among sectors on which the traditional formula of unconditional convergence relies is being increasingly effaced. Instead of clear-cut distinctions among sectors, we have a multi-sectoral fringe present in every part of the economy. So that's the first horn of the dilemma. And then the second horn of the dilemma is the formula is broken of economic growth, move workers from the less productive to the more productive sector of the economy, that is from agriculture to industry, meaning conventional industrialization. But what's the alternative? The alternative would seem to be a socially and economically inclusive form of the knowledge economy. And that nowhere exists. Nowhere in the world does that exist. So if even the richest economies with the most educated populations have been unable to achieve an inclusive form of the knowledge economy, or even to begin movement in that direction, how could we expect the developing countries with their vast problems to do so? That's the dilemma. And it is my thesis that this dilemma has a solution. There is a false solution, there's a false dilemma, and that the solution consists in the stepwise development of an inclusive form of the knowledge economy, through the fulfillment of the educational, the moral, social, and the legal institutional requirements of an inclusive form of the knowledge economy. And that is then, or that should be, the focus of debate and of aspiration in the world. Take this out so we see better. Not just questions, but propositions. Yes.
Professor, I'd like to ask about the most advanced forms of production. all the readings and the class today were about this issue, and at least in Charles Sable reading and best reading, one big focus of the most advanced practice of production is a kind of the Japanese or the post-Fordism way to produce. However, Charles Sable, the first book of Charles Sable was in 1984 with Priory, and then advocate that these advanced forms of production are not only more productive, but were kind of revolutionary practice that will change the paradigm of mass production to the other forms of production. And this form of production was developed in Japan, basically. However, 30 years after that, the Japanese economy is not the most advanced and not the most productive economy in the world. And my first question, what happened? Because according to this idea, this kind of practice that was developed in Japan will improve the Japanese productivity and growth, and will transform economy worldwide. However, that's not happening. So this is the first question. I have a lot of questions, but that's
Do you want to comment on this, Danny? Or you sure?
I think that's a very, very good and very interesting question, and I also maybe forces us to look at today's technology and the promise that it offers in light of an earlier technological revolution, which many saw to offer similar kind of promise. And I think that's, in essence, sort of a very important core of the problem. I think Chuck Sable and Mike Piori now, when they look at that book, they express, I mean, they recognize that there was a certain element of optimism which did not pan out. And as you rightly said, the idea was that these new technologies, which was very much modeled on the Japanese or the Toyota production, which was sort of the kind of advanced version of mass production, but still largely viewed as taking place in the context of manufacturing, would disseminate, and that dissemination throughout the economy would produce very much the kind of what Professor Unger has called a socially inclusive mass production economy, or an advanced technology economy, the terminology economy not having come into use yet. So the question is what has gone wrong, and how does that inform us about what the issues that await the knowledge economy are? I think, perhaps the simplest cut at the answer, which I think also has some implications for today's discussion, would be to look at it purely from the perspective of the skill requirements of these new technologies. So the simplest story of what went wrong is that everything was fine with these advanced production technologies, but that there was a process of skill upgrading that went with these new technologies, and the actual development of the skills of the labor force never really caught up with that. And in some ways, if you look at these challenges from the perspective of skills and training, and you can say that one key feature of each of these new waves of technologies, and the reason that they remain the vanguard, they start as the vanguard, they grow, but they are unable to overcome the inequalities, and in some ways actually aggravate those inequalities, is that the skill requirements of these new technologies remained relatively limited. Now, in the case of these sort of the Japanese-style technologies, there was also something happening on the demand side, which is that just as these technologies were spreading and the skill requirement was increasing, with the overall skill level of the labor force not keeping abreast. On the demand side, that demand was shifting towards services, so that people wanted more entertainment, more education, more health services, better public administration, more community services, many of which, in fact, those kinds of Toyota production methods were not necessarily as directly applicable. And therefore, the process of deindustrialization that set in, which was a reflection of the shift towards services, was the force that cut from the demand side, whereas the sort of relatively limited supply of skills was the force on the supply side. So one explanation would be that essentially those two forces combined to make that earlier innovations, their scale and scope, a lot less narrow, a lot more narrow than Pierre and Sable predicted. So the result of that was many of the sort of the consequences that we're talking about now: process of deindustrialization, a process of the labor markets becoming increasingly dual that went with that, and rising inequalities and rising cleavages. Now the question is, in what sense is sort of today's technologies sort of different? If you look at it from the perspective of just the skill requirements, it has many of the same consequences and many of the problems. And you can say that the hyper-insularity, to use Roberto's term, of this new economy, might have a lot to do with the fact that in order to really be part of the knowledge economy, not just a consumer of its products, all the digital gadgets and the software and the internet and platforms that come with it, but to be actually a participant as a producer, participant in this peer production network, in these decentralized networks, that you have to have these skills and the resources, and those remain highly concentrated. On the other hand, I think, as also Roberto mentioned, that these technologies have the capacity to transcend manufacturing. They're no longer linked or attached to manufacturing. They can spread. In fact, they are spreading throughout large parts of the services economy as well. And if they're going to have an impact, they'll have to be part of services, because manufacturing is becoming such a small part. Now, pessimists like Robert Gordon, who you read, I think, last week, will say that, yes, in principle, but you don't see it nearly as much. So if you think about where is the bulk of services, it's again things like education or health or public administration, personal and community services, where in fact much of these new economy technological advances have actually made relatively small inroads. And part of the explanation of the puzzle as to why, if this knowledge economy is exploding, why is it that total productivity in the economy isn't doing much better, is that in fact it just happens to remain relatively limited. So this is another facet of the lack of dissemination, and how do you connect the vanguard to the rest of the economy. So the questions that we need to sort out here is really how much of this is innate to the technology. Again, the simplest story is this technology is so skill intensive, so capital intensive, that it cannot disseminate. Because there is this race that we will never win, that we will never democratize skills and capital to the extent that you can make these things spread and disseminate for everyone. To what extent is it actually the result of market or institutional or policy choices that we're making that is resulting in this? To what extent it is the result of many of these issues that we're going to be getting into in terms of property, in terms of legal regimes, in terms of the educational system, in terms of competition policy and industrial policy that we allow firms to monopolize markets and our existing intellectual property rights and so forth. So that's what we need to unpack and talk a lot more about.
So I want to make 3 remarks in response to your provocation. First of all, we have to be careful in the confusion of the descriptive categories. So Sable and Piori and Best, writing a couple of decades ago, are focusing on a narrow part of this phenomenon of the knowledge economy that I've addressed. The Toyota method of production, a certain way of organizing work, and the technologies with which it was associated. To a large extent, the Toyota method of production was a way of motivating workers, as well as of exploiting the potential of those technologies without using them to bring about a wider transformation of industrial relations. Technology by itself means very little or almost nothing. So in my account of the knowledge economy, the technologies are really only an instrument or a materialization of a set of practices and ideas. They have no intrinsic transformative power. So the project of the knowledge economy that I'm describing does not consist primarily or essentially in the adoption of certain technologies. It's a change in the regime of production in all the ways that I described. Now, my second observation is that the overcoming of insularity or hyperinsularity, and therefore the deepening, the achievement of the potential of the knowledge economy, requires a whole set of other changes. That's what I'm hoping will be the second part of our discussion. Changes in institutions, changes in the nature of education, changes in macroeconomic policies that relate breakthroughs in the constraints on demand to breakthroughs in the constraints on supply. And in all of these ways, Japan, your example, failed by the test of structural transformation. Now, I want to make a third remark, and the third remark has to do with the more intangible question of attitudes. So there is the following problem or danger that we should seek to avoid. Many of the progressives who came to study industrial organization and its transformation had been trained in Marxist or neo-Marxist theory, and then were disappointed by what happened in the world. But they somehow seem often to have carried over to their studies of industrial change the characteristic attitudes of Marxism. So the attitude of Marxism is, we don't have to have a project because history supplies the project. So there's a dialectic unfolding in the world. Let's ride it. Now, that dialectic in the Marxist form they had ceased to believe in. But then they discovered what seemed to be this change in the character of economic life, and that then seemed like a micro version, a midget version of this Marxist dialectic. So they'll ride that, and that never works. History never supplies the project. The whole tone of my account of the knowledge economy is different. I don't see the knowledge economy as having an intrinsic dynamic towards inclusion and radicalization. On the contrary, what we see is its confinement, the squandering of its potential related to its confinement, and there's nothing in the historical process of economic change that would somehow automatically overcome these limitations. We are the ones who have to overcome it through some project that is against the grain, against the current, against the path of least resistance. History won't give it to us.
My question was about institutional requirement to include an inclusive vanguard. And one of the things that I was thinking about was the education system, and your points on the type of education needed
Yes.
in terms of being inclusive and ensuring more critical thinking, more cooperation. It's just in the context of a developing country, for example, my country, Pakistan. Given the current state of education, it's very hard for me to imagine kind of getting there to such.
I understand.
And I wanted to know your thoughts of what is the impetus for this change? Is it going to come from civil society? Is it government? Is it collaborative effort? And at what point can we go from something that seems so dismally far from what is being proposed?
Well, you're breaking down the sequence that I wanted to establish. So I propose to have a second stage of discussion about the conditions for the overcoming of the confinement, because I didn't want and I don't want our discussion of this central issue to be, as it were, just an afterthought, a penumbra of the discussion we're having up to now. So I just asked for permission to postpone this, so we don't discuss it episodically. We discuss systematically the conditions for the overcoming of the confinement. Yes.
I want to ask about the political regime, goes with the method of manufacture. Because when I look at the previous method, for logistic mass production, democracy makes sense. Because people meet, and you need the skilled labor, and they organize, and in the end you get democracy. Now, the most advanced way of production is confined. And we see books of people in the Silicon Valley write about the notion that in the future there will be 10% people who are skillful and will live in prosperity, and the other 90% are less humane, they will live in a very, very poor state.
Yes.
And the political regime, you understand, it's like, I think maybe Jack London book. But I don't know, this is the kind of regime of 10% of the unions go with the capital, and the all other 90% live under the poverty line. And the question is, what kind of regime, political regime, can we offer in order to change, not to do it through production, but on the political model?
And in order to achieve this more disseminated and radicalized form of the knowledge economy.
Yes, the political regime.
But we all want to talk about the next stage, the overcoming. So do I. So the way I think of it, just to anticipate the shape of the discussion that I propose to you, is there are three sets of requirements for this dissemination of the knowledge economy. There are cognitive educational requirements, a different kind of education, both general education and vocational education. It's a project of national liberation. It's intimately related to everything else in the country. Then there are social moral conditions. What are the initiatives that we can take to promote this disposition to cooperate, this elevation of the level of trust and discretion, this accumulation of social capital? It's not just a brute fact about society. It's something that can be modified. And then the third set of conditions are the legal institutional conditions. In what institutional and legal framework can we develop the access to the resources needed for a disseminated form of the knowledge economy? Now, having posed those questions, then I then want to ask, under what political and cultural conditions is it more or less likely that we could satisfy those three sets of requirements? And I'm going to want to make an argument that we need a certain transformation of culture, the radicalization of an experimentalist impulse in culture, and we need a direction in politics, which is a deepening of democracy. All these transformations are very unlikely to occur in the framework of the flawed, weak democracies that exist today, or of authoritarian vanguardism. So that's where the discussion is going. But it's not something, to go back to your question, it's not something that happens automatically. This is a project. This is a transformative project. And once again, I ask permission to postpone the substance to a later stage. Now, you also.
So my question is, I'm still a bit challenged.
A little louder, please.
I'm still a bit challenged on the premises.
Louder, louder, louder. So people behind you can hear.
Okay, so even the premises that you made about the confinement of this knowledge economy, and also the kind of inequality that it is creating, and unemployment, and also the technologies that it is like it's just providing as a kind of technology that is complementary to like labor, and labor is not, now labor is beginning to like substitute with the new sets of technologies, robotics, and etc. And given all these challenges, how would you recommend this kind of technology to like developing countries? For example, if you take Ethiopia, we have 100 million population, and of these 100 million, 80 million are farmers. And if you come up with this set of technology and knowledge economy, if you try to implement this one, you're a big challenge. But then, if you come up with the old methods of the old methods of like industrialization, it would be easier for us like to transform labor or to move labor out of agriculture to like municipal manufacturing with less skill, and there would be like more income, and then step by step it would be promising for the country to transform a higher or to be like a process to the new modern economy. And then even in the new economies that you say, even these advanced economies are not enough solutions to act. These advanced economies are not enough solutions to transform all of us, to take to outdoor this knowledge economy and implement it. How would you?
So what's the question? Is the question about how this dilemma of development applies to the condition of poorest economies? Because in a way, this discussion that we have applies to the middle income major developing countries. It's not clear how it applies to countries that are beneath that threshold. What is your
So,
view?
as I understand it, I think you're in a way you're challenging the notion that, I mean, there's. Let me back up here, and I'll come to your question. And I think so. I think one of the very interesting things that you said, Roberto, which I largely agree, is that we are now in a stage of thinking about development policy and growth policy, where in fact this traditional dichotomy between developed and developing countries is disappearing. Is disappearing because the fundamental challenge seems to be the same. And that challenge is how you're going to connect the most advanced, globally most integrated parts, the advanced parts of the economy with the other parts. Now, in the advanced countries, maybe it's a little bit of a thicker vanguard, and in the developing countries, it's a thinner vanguard, but it definitely exists. It even exists in some of the least developed countries like Ethiopia. You still have that vanguard there. It's just that it's very, very thin. And as you rightly point out, the question there is going to be how do we deal with the 80% of the population that is in the countryside, essentially farmers, and the central question there is it really does it make sense to think that even countries like Ethiopia are going to be leapfrogging that stage of mass production, so that they start thinking about their main development challenges being, how do we get people into the advanced sectors of the economy? My answer to this will be that certainly I think that the situation you described, and with which I largely agree, is one that's much more relevant, applicable to middle-income countries. This is really, if you talk about in Argentina or China or Brazil and Mexico, the development challenge for those countries has pretty much merged as the one for the advanced countries.
Yes.
I do think that for low-income countries like Ethiopia, there might still be some room for, a country like Ethiopia is really, I think now has only about 5% of its labor force in manufacturing. So it's extremely small. So there is still some room for them to pursue the traditional model. But I think what even policymakers in a country like Ethiopia has to understand is that, Ethiopia is never going to be a South Korea, which put more than a quarter of its labor force into manufacturing. Maybe, the share of labor force in manufacturing in a country like Ethiopia might peak at 10%. That's still, sort of doubling, and there's still some potential for that. But then we have the sort of the question about how we're still, where's the rest of the people going to go? And it's going to go into services. And it's going to be urban services because they are going to be getting out of agriculture. And so many of these questions, I think, keep coming back, that even today, even in a country like Ethiopia, many of these things are going to remain a challenge. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have to give up on industrialization completely, but it's just not going to be as potent and as long-term a solution to development challenge that a country like Ethiopia faces. That would be, so that's, I think, is the sense in which this challenge is quite universal.
But the problem of the leapfrogging that you refer to manifests itself very clearly in these continental developing countries, these middle-income countries. So take the case of my country, Brazil. The heart of the Brazilian industrial system, established in the southeast of the country in the middle of the 20th century, is Fordist mass production. And in Brazil, it does not exist in the form of what I call the sidekick, because for the most part, it's not related to the vanguard. It doesn't play a subordinate role in the worldwide knowledge economy. It's the leftover. And it has remained competitive only on the basis of restrictions to the returns to labor. And Brazil is being deindustrialized. It's one of these countries that's suffering this phenomenon of premature deindustrialization. So then we have two tasks of reconstruction, the more familiar one and the less familiar one. The less familiar one is related to the issue that you raised. So the more familiar one is, how is it that in the industrial centers of the country, we can convert mass production to this higher stage of the knowledge economy, rather than simply trying to buy a few more years for mass production. The attempt to buy a few more years for mass production is the residual political economy of both the right-wing populists and the social democrats in the rich countries, as you can see in the United States. But then we have a second task, which is, what about the rest of the country? does the rest of Brazil need first to become the São Paulo of the mid-20th century in order to become something else? That doesn't make sense. So then we have the project of trying to organize a direct passage from, in the rest of the country, from a pre-Fordist to a post-Fordist style of production without passing through the purgatory of a belated Fordism. That's a problem, and that problem manifests itself in all these major middle-income developing countries. So it's not just in the poorest countries that you have the leapfrogging problem.
I'd like to go back to the question of secular stagnation. And if I was to do a Super Bowl between Gordon and the two gentlemen from the MIT that I can't pronounce the names, I would say that Gordon is winning now in my head. I think it makes sense to say that we're not going to find out, we're not going to have technologies that are going to keep growth at the same rate we've seen in the last 150 years. It's not given. We might not have the technologies to keep the pace we had in the previous 150 years. And I remember Gordon was asked once if the problem was in the way we measured GDP, and that we are not taking into account things like we ask for, we use our phones to ask for a cab, and it comes very, very quickly. And then he mentioned that things like opening the tap and having water is not counted in the GDP, and that was a bigger transformation than having a cell phone in your hands today. So the first point I want to make is that it doesn't make sense to me to say that we are going to always find technology that is going to keep the pace of growth going up and up or keeping the same. And if we have that in mind, if technology is not just the source of growth, does it make any sense that this new economy is going to be spread or not?
I'm sorry, I just don't understand that remark. So has there ever been a technology with greater revolutionary potential than artificial intelligence? It's limitless. So to say, well, the steam engine was more radical than artificial intelligence, to me that makes no sense. Of course, technology in itself does nothing. Technology is just the materialization of a certain way of connecting our experiments in the transformation of nature with our experiments in the transformation of how we cooperate. But this wave of technological innovations that now exists is as revolutionary as any wave that has ever appeared in history. So I just don't understand the basis for this remark of yours, that there's some kind of deflationary decline in the potential of technologies. I don't see that. Why? Why do you think that?
Are you saying that that this is just the latest round in a wave of historical waves of technology? But are you saying that this is something genuinely revolutionary compared to earlier waves? So is this? So
I'm saying first that I see no basis for the claim that the present wave of technological innovations is less transformative or has less potential than the technological innovations of 100 years ago. And if we look at them, they have a much more manifold character. The artificial intelligence, unlike the steam engine, is not just the transformation of one thing into something else. Its potential is vast to transform the character of production and of human life itself. So these have huge potential, but no technology has automatically realizes a potential. The character of technologies depends on the social and institutional context in which they're deployed. So I think that the idea that somehow we've harvested the low-hanging fruit of technological innovation, that we're sort of at the end of a period of discovery, to me has no basis. I can't even understand it. It seems to me to be a naturalization of these compromises that we've accepted in the confinement of the knowledge economy.
Well, let me say a couple of things. First, this is not our central discussion, but for the benefit of some of the students here who may have been exposed to more economics than others, let me register a complaint.
Yes.
With respect to your use of diminishing returns, which it partly goes to our earlier discussions about whether that's universal or is anything universal. And you said that the notion of diminishing returns is something that comes as close to claiming universal status within economics. And I think that's false. I think you were conflating a number of different concepts in economics there. One is the notion of returns to scale. If there is anything that's nearly universal in economics, although not nearly so, would be there. It's actually the notion of constant returns, not diminishing returns. There's the notion, secondly, of the concept of marginal products, where there is a notion of diminishing marginal product. And that is something that's, of course, entirely compatible with the notion of constant returns to scale.
Yes.
Because diminishing marginal product refers to the return that you get from utilizing an additional resource like labor or capital while holding all other inputs constant. So you can have diminishing returns to a particular input, even though you have constant returns to scale to all the inputs taken together. But the notion of diminishing returns in that sense is a consequence of constant returns to scale, and has only the same universal status to the extent that constant returns to scale would, which is really an issue it's an empirical issue. It's not one that has necessarily.
But again, the question,
feature.
the substantive question I was trying to signal.
So I'm just coming. Yeah. I think the substance of what you were talking about is, and I think at some point you mentioned the notion of, and by the way, all of those things are essentially technological features to which there is no particular economic substance attached to. Whether it's constant returns to scale, whether it's the notion of returns to scale, or it's the notion of marginal products to a particular input. You also mentioned, and I think the third notion that got a little bit thrown in is exogenous versus endogenous technological progress. And I think you probably substantively you had more stake put on the notion of endogenous technological progress or endogenous innovation. And that is something that is
So there are two distinctions that are related, right? One is endogenous versus exogenous, and the other is continuous versus discontinuous, and they're related. So it is obviously the second concept of marginal returns that is what I was referring to.
Right.
But in relation to this idea that what the knowledge economy does is to change the relation of production to innovation, so that innovation becomes, at the limit, perpetual and endogenous.
Again, sort of you can have all of these things can be combined in a number of different ways, and I don't think there's anything. There's nothing in the present wave of technologies that suggests the notion of diminishing returns has gone away. I think whether diminishing returns goes away or not depends on the notion of whether there is overall scale economies. And if you want to say that because of ongoing and possibly discontinuous endogenous technological change, that there are dynamic scale economies, and as a result of that, the notion of...
No, I don't think the crucial issue is scale. I accept entirely that first clarification of yours. I think the issue, the substantive issue under whatever vocabulary is, are these innovations things that come from outside, exogenous, produced by science, then translated into technology, and then we use them, we exploit them to the hilt, they, as it were, peter out the idea of the marginal decline, huh? As opposed to a situation in
No, I'm
which...
sorry, that's not how we use it.
Well,
that's not, yeah.
as opposed to the situation in which the production process is organized, I said by analogy to a laboratory, by a process of scientific discovery, so that innovation, rather than being punctuated, is perpetual, as well as being more internal to the system of production.
So this is, I mean, going a little bit more in that sort of more substantive direction. I think this is the kind of thing, for example, you know, Robert Gordon might want to
contest,
right?
Yes.
So that would be the issue. You know, sort of, you know, you are presenting this. I'm likely to agree that in terms of one of the characteristics of the new economy is that there's this notion of continuous development through this sort of decentralized peer production processes and new types of knowledge that has kind of a cumulative nature.
But with this very important precaution that came out in our conversation, that this is not something that automatically or naturally happens, that this is a potential of this form of production,
right,
which is for the most part not realized.
Right. So that's actually, this is probably the crux of the matter, and I wanted to come to that. So you know, the question about why is there's this dichotomy between the promise and the actual reality, and I think sort of, you know, that I think it's absolutely critical to get a handle on that in order then to be able to say this is how we're going to overcome it.
Yes.
I think there's a version of what you said. I don't think you really mean it that way, but I'm just going to state it in cartoonish form so that maybe we can, you know, draw ourselves back from it. Is the notion that all of this is, you know, fully malleable. We can, you know, technology has nothing that is necessarily fixed and comes with it. There's nothing intrinsic to the knowledge economy that, you know, that isn't shapeable, and therefore, you know, sort of, you know, basically it's just happenstance that we've gotten this hyper-insularity, or that the promise doesn't, you know, that hasn't been fulfilled by the reality. So let's pose the puzzle. Again, let me repose it, and then say a couple of words about that, and then, you know, we can continue about how to close the gap. So the puzzle is, you know, that you know, in principle, many of these elements of the knowledge economy ought to be equalizing, ought to have, you know, sort of ought to bring greater inclusiveness, because this new technology in principle breaks down hierarchies. It calls for more decentralized forms of production. It calls us to reconsider, you know, traditional forms of property. It breaks down transaction costs, so breaks down
But it's the
barriers to
technology
entry.
that does that?
Yes, I mean, there's something very technological about the notion of transaction costs in this context. That it is that, you know, technology itself, to the extent that it breaks down communication costs between the, you know, innovator in Ethiopia and Silicon Valley, you know, that's a feature of technology that is largely independent of, you know, sort of, maybe it's a residue of all the institutions we put in place that enabled, you know, the fact that, you know, there is an internet now, and therefore, you know, communication is virtually costless.
But I understand
but that transaction cost is for all practical purposes, or that decline in transaction cost is a central feature of the technology.
I mean, this is a fundamental question of how how we understand the relation between the technological and the social or the institutional. So let me give again a military analogy just because I think it simplifies things. So at the end of the 18th century, there was a big development in artillery. Artillery became both more powerful and more maneuverable in the field. And the question is, under what military formation could the technological potential be used? So in the traditional infantry battalions of conscripted and reluctant peasants, they had to be kept in tight formations with people with bayonets behind them, because otherwise they would run away. And then, as opposed to the Army of Revolutionary France, then was an army of citizens, and it could be disposed in a more decentralized and flexible form. So then that army was able to use the potential of the artillery much more effectively. So in other words, it wasn't the artillery itself that led the army to be organized in one way or another way. It's that different social formations were able to respond to the technological invention in different ways.
No, I don't think we're disagreeing at that level, but I think what I'm saying is there is, so when I say that technology had the promise of breaking down some of these barriers, is the notion that now whether whether you can actually take advantage of that and organize yourself appropriately in a way that gets disseminated and becomes broadly part of society is precisely what we're talking about. But the question that it breaks down some of the traditional barriers to access because of this reduction in transaction costs, because it breaks down some of these traditional forms of hierarchy, because before you said as you needed command and control and a factory system and a hierarchical firm to run your firm, and now that's not where the technology is going to pay returns, and therefore you realize that you don't have to do it that way anymore, because the horizontal aspects are going to pay more.
Well,
so those are things that come with the technology, but I don't think we're disagreeing substantively.
I'm not sure. I just want to insist on this a little more. So take the example of Walmart. So Walmart then assimilates the new digital technologies as a device to manage more efficiently its inventory, its complex information, but not in order radically to change its way of working or its relations of production. So all of these technologies, despite their revolutionary potential, can be domesticated or appropriated in the context of largely untransformed relations of production. What you can say is that the consequence is that they then take much less advantage of the potential of the technologies. But the technologies in and of themselves produce no transformation.
Well, I mean, the technologies bring the ability to transform,
yes,
and then they're combined with the existing incentives and existing forms of social organization to play to bring out their full consequences. So I don't think we're disagreeing there. The question is, you've laid out also, I think, that in principle these things can be democratizing and more produce socially inclusive consequences. And the reality is that in many domains, not only have they not done that,
yes,
they've actually contributed.
As in this phenomenon of hyperinsularity.
What you call the issue of hyperinsularity is that, in fact, they have created additional barriers, additional divides in society. And so the question that I want to pose and examine is to understand exactly why that has
yes,
happened. Because I think it's an important step before we can step back and say, this is how we're going to fix it. That this is going to be the recipe for doing
Correct.
that.
So
And I think so we need to diagnose exactly why technology in this broad form is producing these adverse implications. And I think, and there are different types of explanation there that I think we need to confront. And I think we cannot skip the step of just saying, this is, then let's jump to the solution without having actually
Of course.
understood the mechanisms that produce this.
Of course.
Okay.
But
So-
it's not just technology that is being abbreviated or confined. It's this whole practice of production,
Exactly.
right?
No,
Technology is just
Yeah,
the material instrument.
No, we're not disagreeing
Yeah.
there. I think I just want to lay out first that there is, that we need to fill out to that causal terrain a little bit more, because that's going to be important. I think it's critical.
So to me, the beginning, the point of departure is this phenomenon of the path of least resistance. So an innovation happens in the world, a combination of organizational and technological innovations. And the most probable expression of it is always the one that minimizes its disruptive impact on the ruling interests and established preconceptions. So it cuts it down to size. So, and of course, then the causal story has a very particular structure that we have to tell, as you suggest. But that seems to me to be the general character of the phenomenon, right?
So that's one possible explanation. I think it needs to be sketched out, and I think it would be useful to hear the full story, because if it's the existing set of powerful interests that are essentially blocking the more fruitful deployment and dissemination of these technologies.
And assumptions, so not just interests, but
right.
ideas.
An idea. So that so let's I think we've made an inroad, a slight inroad into that, but I think particularly as regards the structure of powerful interests, I think it would need to be laid out. But that's not the only possible explanation, and there are possibly others as well. And I think one of them is already, and probably the one that an economist would point out the first, would be the skill requirements of this technology. That is that these technologies are highly skill intensive. So if you take the things that artificial intelligence, that's wonderful. But who is going to actually be producing artificial intelligence? You need to be able to write the code, and you need to develop the code for machine learning and to be able to improve on that. And so the beneficiaries of the revolution with respect to artificial intelligence, as transformative as it might be, are necessarily going to be, on the one hand, knowledge workers, the highly skilled code writers and software engineers. On the other hand, it's going to be the financiers and the managerial elite who are able to package these into marketing opportunities, or actually be able to package these into profit-making operations. So that's a very thin veneer. So if you look at it, sort of, you would say, and many of these new technologies have that feature. So one category of explanations has to do with, these things are extremely skill intensive, and it's going to be very difficult to disseminate on account of that. We can all use the product of machine learning and artificial intelligence in the same way that we can all use a cell phone. But not all of us, very few of us are actually going to be producing this. And therefore, as producers, the benefits, the rents are going to go to a very minor set of things. Now, I'm not saying that is the only or the most important explanation.
No, but
that's one category of explanation that if one thought that this was a big part of the story, it would result in a certain set of priorities in terms of how you would want to address that. Okay?
But
let me not take on that, but I just want to give another example of another area where I think one needs to go through the same kind of logic and confront as another possible hypothesis. That has to do with the fact that many of these new technologies, particularly with respect to those that are on the internet, in particular sort of digital platforms industries, have the feature that they come with what's called network externalities. So these network externalities refers to the idea that a particular set of practices or particular product becomes more appealing to users the more the number of users are already using it. So, a telephone is completely useless if there's only one person at a telephone. But the more people that have a telephone, or it used to be, it's appropriate to tell this in a law school, the story about, one town had a single lawyer and he was very poor. Then another lawyer moved in and they both became very rich. So that's the notion of, lawyers creating work for other lawyers. So that's network externalities. And so the notion of network externalities is that, if you have, it's very difficult to have, Amazon, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Google. These are platforms that have huge network externalities. And one big important feature of these markets, therefore, is that they end up having the characteristic of winner take all. So if you happen to be a little bit more advanced than your next best competitor, you get the whole market, because these are markets that are not going to support more than one firm. And in these winner take all markets with very large network externalities, then you're going to recreate the kind of production structure that you had in the late 19th century with monopolies and trusts that are able to essentially exercise a lot of monopoly power like Google does or Amazon does today. These are largely issues about
depending on factors
conduct.
such as the background regime of property.
Exactly.
Property and data, for example.
Yes, exactly. But you see, that then would call for a kind of set of remedies that have to do with how you deal with property and capital and regulation with respect to competition policy or antitrust policies. So that would take you into a set of thinking about how you would recreate institutional arrangements in a very different direction. Let me just say one more thing, and then I'll just stop. I think we need to sort of have a good account of all of these different possibilities. My bottom line is actually that each one of these might play a big or small role in different domains of this knowledge economy. Overall, we don't know their relative importance, but I think it's very important to ground our remedies or the way we think about institutional transformation in these particular aspects, features.
Well, conceptually, it seems to me there's no clear distinction between this idea that there are causes of the confinement and the claim that we explored before that unlike mass production, the knowledge economy has very demanding conditions. So including the educational conditions, the legal institutional conditions, the conditions regarding social capital and cooperation. In referring to the idea of the path of least resistance, I didn't mean to suggest a conspiracy version. So in other words, it is the path of least resistance because it is the least demanding. Not just in the sense that it accommodates the dominant interest in ideas, but that it doesn't require the fulfillment of all of these demanding conditions. They are objectively very demanding. A different kind of education, a different legal institutional structure, a way of promoting the development of social capital and so forth. So maybe we don't disagree about that, because really a programmatic argument about how to fulfill these conditions is at the same time an answer to your demand for a causal story, because we're saying that this inclusive form of the knowledge economy is not something that could ever exist naturally or spontaneously. It would demand the fulfillment of these very difficult conditions.
Yeah, I don't think that. Yeah, I mean, I don't think necessarily we're far apart. I guess I wanted to foreshadow for our discussion when we talk about specific institutional changes, because there will be a question there that is going to come up in terms of prioritization, in terms of first steps, in terms of what you do in the short run.
Yes.
You know, and that I think will have to be grounded fully into in these kinds of, I would argue, in these causal understandings. So I think there's going to, you're right, they'll come back, but I think it'll have to be integrated into those stories about the priorities and the sequencing of the institutional
So,
transformation.
but just as a matter of the way of organizing discourse, the causal understanding can be developed as an antecedent stage of thinking, antecedent to programmatic, or it can be developed in the context of a programmatic argument. It can be developed in both ways. And because every programmatic argument must make these causal assumptions and develop these causal ideas.
Right, and I guess I'm warning a little bit of a programmatic approach that thinks of those causals in a secondary way, because then the temptation is too strong to cherry pick those causal arguments after the fact.
Well, so then I suppose our plan would be to begin the next class. We don't have class next week, 2 weeks from today, with this discussion about the causes of confinement and the conditions of dissemination. See you 2 weeks from now. Good. I think that was progress. The crisis, the financial crisis, which would be a complete change. So, you know, I don't know whether we can look at the syllabus and decide if we want to skip over something, or we can just amalgamate them.
I wonder if there's a section that is more naturally attuned to this discussion and just transpose those classes.
Well, I think this discussion and the plan
How about
should immediately follow.
moving this part, like just moving this, because in a way, it's really, you know, the inequality part is really, I think we should move this after. How about that?
Well, because this is what we're coming
okay,
at.
that's February, yeah, so moving this up there.
So what would you like to do with respect to the students?
So just move the discourse, since so much of this discussion about, you know, the inclusive knowledge economy is really about the inequality of the future.
So tell them to do these readings for
So let's just send them a note saying
okay.
that we're moving the class of March 19th will be this one.
Okay.
And then just so that everything else moves on.
So I can write them a note and say that to do the readings of March 19th to February
All
26th.
right, you can just do this through Canvas.
Yeah. So through the website, sure. I can do it. Okay. Or do you want to do it? Okay. And just say that this would then be a continuation. So your notice through Canvas goes to all the students in the course, right? Yes. Yes. Well, this is an old discussion in legal theory from the 19th century. So labor that is not slave labor or serf labor, labor that is given freely, that is undertaken freely, voluntarily, can take three main forms.